Hello. So far, the majority of the poems that we learned were from the Tang Dynasty, and in particular, the Prime Tang era. In literature, because Tang poetry is so important, we normally divide the whole Tang Dynasty into four sub-periods: Early Tang, Prime Tang, Middle Tang, and Late Tang. Prime Tang is when poetry really flourished. Its form, subject matters, and way of writing all matured, with numerous highly accomplished poets and best-known names emerging. For example, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Zhihuan, Wang Changling, Wang Wei, Meng Haoran were all from this era. This era roughly ended with the death of Du Fu, or the end of Anshi Rebellion, when the Tang Dynasty all went downhill and could never revive to its former glory. In this Middle Tang period, there were also many excellent poets. Actually, there are more poets than in the Prime Tang, well, partly because this period is longer. For example, Meng Jiao, who wrote 游子吟, 谁言寸草心, 报得三春晖, and Bai Juyi, who wrote 野火烧不尽, 春风吹又生. They were both from this period. In the Middle Tang period, because the regime became less stable and the wealth of the country massively diminished, for long stretches of time, people's lives were rather miserable. They had to work hard, but then were mercilessly taxed or recruited to the army, and in general, in extreme poverty. So certain poets who witnessed this felt the need to address this issue urgently. They saw poetry as a type of tool or weapon to reflect the reality, to cry out to the emperor, to the court, to the local government, that something needs to be done to save these poor ordinary people. Poetry had obviously, previously, mostly served as a form of expression of poets' personal feeling. And in the Prime Tang era, because of the prosperity everywhere, would inevitably be blended with a lot of romanticism and heroism, as we've seen in a lot of such poems already. But in the Middle Tang, this romanticism and heroism turned into more realism, and poetry started to, as a main movement, describe the life of the most insignificant people in the society, hoping everyone could realize their difficulty and do something accordingly to relieve their pains and misery. Among the leaders of this movement, there was Bai Juyi, whom we already know. And we have Li Shen, whose poems we are going to learn today. Coincidentally, both poets had the same year of birth and death. So both Bai Juyi and Li Shen, they were born in 772 AD, 2 years after the great Du Fu had died. One thing to add is that prior to these poets, there were indeed others who touched upon this subject. For example, Du Fu himself did write a lot of masterpieces on ordinary people's misery. But Du Fu mostly did this from his own personal perspective and never did so purposely in large volumes. Because of the nature of such poems, the language must be plain, it must be easy to understand, and the message must be clear, unambiguous, and require no further extra thinking. So sometimes when we read these poems, they would feel more like folk songs or ballads, rather than a carefully structured formal poem. The poems we are going to learn today is titled Ming Nong by Li Shen. Ming means pitiful, be sympathetic. Nong is Nongmin, peasants or farmers. It's about the poet's strong sympathy towards peasants. He wrote 2 of them in one go. This was a very common practice, that a poet might write a number of poems at the same time on a theme, and collectively give all these poems a single title. Each of the poems would be called Qi Yi or Qi Er, etc. If you still remember the 2 Liangzhou Ci we learned before, one by Wang Han, 葡萄美酒夜光杯, and the other by Wang Zhihuan, 黄河远上白云间. Both poets on the occasion wrote two 凉州词, and we only picked the first of the two of their respective writing. In today's case, because the two poems are quite simple, we will just do them both. Let's read the first one together. 春种一粒粟，秋收万颗子。四海无闲田，农夫犹饿死。春 is spring, 种 is to plant, 粒 is a single something, a piece. For example, 一粒米, a grain of rice. 粟 is a general term for grains or any type of rice, wheat, etc. So this line is saying, in the spring, you plant a single grain. And then, 秋收万颗子. 秋 is autumn. 收 is to collect, to harvest. 万, 10,000. 颗 also means a piece of something. For example, 一颗糖, a sweet. 子 here means grains. So in the spring, you plant a single grain, and in the autumn, you can harvest 10,000 of them. This is how nature works. And logically, as long as you work hard enough, you will be rewarded by harvesting thousands of grains to feed yourself and provide good life for your family. Let's read on. 四 is four, 海 is sea. In ancient Chinese, so people believed they were surrounded by four seas at the four directions, and this 四海 later became a set term to refer to the whole country or the whole world as they knew it. In Chinese, there are quite a few such set terms for this reference. For example, we also have 五湖, five lakes, or 天下, under the sky. They both refer to the same concept, the whole world, and can often be used interchangeably. 无 is none, 闲 is leisure, here means unused. 田 is like field or farmland. So all around the whole country, there were no farmland that was not used. Basically saying all the farmlands were being used to grow crops. But then, the final line revealed the true intention of the poem. A big turn, a big shock. 农夫 is peasants, farmers. 游 means still. 饿 is hungry. 死 to die. So 饿死 means to starve. So even though all the farmlands are being used, even though from one single grain in the spring you can harvest 10,000, peasants still have not enough to eat and have to starve to their death. There is so much strong pity, shock, and even anger in the last line. What caused this ridiculous situation? It must be because of the unfair tax system and other policies which could effectively rob those peasants' earnings throughout the year. But the poet did not specify. He would rather people to read the poem and realize the plight these peasants were at, and hoped people who were in the power could think about it themselves and do something. The second of the two poems is milder in tone and more directly written about what the peasant's life was like, to bring about people's deep sympathy toward them. This is probably the better known of the two, especially the last two lines. Let's read them together first. 锄禾日当午，汗滴禾下土。谁知盘中餐，粒粒皆辛苦。锄 is to plow, to hoe, basically describing labor work people do in the farmland. 禾 is crops. 日 is the sun. 当 is when, right at certain time. 午 is 中午, midday. So the peasants have to labor in the fields while the sun is right at the middle. It would be very hot, wouldn't it? Yes, so 汗, sweat. 滴 to drop, to drip. 下 is under, and the 土 is soil. So sweat would drop onto the soil under the crops. This is really hard work, and this scene would probably be repeated day after day throughout the year. If we link these two lines to the first poem, 春种一粒粟，秋收万颗子, does it mean after you plant a seed, it would just magically become 10,000? No, it had to be labored upon by these peasants in harsh conditions. And if you can think about this and realize what had to be done, you would have a new realm of understanding about the food that eventually arrives in your plate. 水 is who, 知 is 知道, to know, 盘 is plate, 中 is middle, inside, 餐 is meal. 皆 is all of them, all. 辛苦 means hard work. So the poet was saying, who knows? Who could have imagined? Who could have thought that the meal in our plate, every bit of it, every grain of it, is coming from hard work, from toil, from exhausting laboring? This pair of lines were really thought-provoking, looking at how food is made possible from a unique angle and telling a simple truth that hadn't been told before. This 谁知盘中餐，粒粒皆辛苦 has since become widely popular and remained one of the all-time favorite lines from Asian poetry among the Chinese people. These two poems, each picking a different theme, showed thoroughly the profound sympathy the poet had towards these hard-working peasants at the time. Now, a lot of times when something good is written, or bad actually, despite the original intention of the author, the readers collectively could give it a new meaning which might be very different from the original. For example, nowadays, when we say 谁知盘中餐，粒粒皆辛苦, we do not necessarily mean we feel sympathetic to the growers of the food, but most often are to tell people to treasure food, to not waste food. Because it's so hard to grow, we shouldn't waste it. So even in the current day, even when perhaps the farmer's life is not as harsh, there is scarcity of food around the world. And we should still respect food. We could still quote 谁知盘中餐，粒粒皆辛苦. You see, in this case, the readers can almost become part of the creation and give another layer of very fitting meaning, a modern meaning, which I often find fascinating. That's all. Thank you very much.